The transatlantic slave trade was one of the darkest and most brutal chapters in human history. From the late 15th century through the 19th century, this massive system of human trafficking saw the forced removal of millions of Africans from their native lands and their enslavement in the Americas, Europe, and other parts of the world. Driven by economic greed, colonial expansion, and racial ideologies, the trade reshaped continents and destroyed countless lives. It began with European powers, particularly Portugal and Spain, exploring the coasts of West Africa in the late 1400s. What initially started as a pursuit of gold, spices, and other trade goods quickly turned into a monstrous enterprise of enslaving human beings. Africans were captured in raids or purchased from local rulers and traders who profited by selling prisoners of war, criminals, or even civilians caught in targeted kidnappings. These people were shackled, marched to the coast under inhumane conditions, and crammed into holding forts or dungeons along the shore. Places like Elmina Castle in modern-day Ghana, which became infamous for the suffering endured by captives within its walls. Once a ship was ready to depart, captives were forced aboard and packed into the lower decks in appalling conditions. This voyage across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, was a journey of immense suffering and death. People were chained together in rows with barely any space to move. Sanitation was non-existent. Disease spread rapidly. Food was scarce, often rotten, and water was rationed. Many captives became so desperate that they attempted suicide, while others died from dysentery, fever, or beatings inflicted by the crew. Historians estimate that between 15 and 20% of all Africans who embarked on the Middle Passage died before reaching their destination. This means that out of the estimated 12.5 million Africans who were shipped across the Atlantic, over 2 million perished at sea. Those who survived faced a future of forced labor, humiliation, and violence. Upon arrival in the Americas, enslaved Africans were taken to markets and auction blocks, where they were sold like livestock. Buyers inspected their bodies, examined their teeth, tested their physical strength, and made purchase decisions as if selecting beasts of burden. Families were separated, never to see each other again. Children were ripped from their mothers. Husbands and wives were sold to different owners, often hundreds of miles apart. The psychological trauma was immense, and the pain never left those who endured it. The majority of enslaved people were sent to plantation economies in the Caribbean, South America, particularly Brazil and the American South. They were forced to work in sugar, tobacco, coffee, and cotton fields from sunrise to sunset under the watchful eyes of brutal overseers. The labor was backbreaking. The punishments for disobedience or slow work were barbaric. Whippings, beatings, branding, and mutilation were common. Enslaved women were not only forced into labor but were often victims of sexual violence at the hands of their owners or overseers. Enslaved people had no legal rights. They were considered property under the law. Their identities were erased, their languages forbidden, their religions condemned. Despite all this, they resisted. Some resisted by escaping, some through rebellion, and others by preserving their culture in secret, singing songs of sorrow and hope, passing down stories and traditions that kept their heritage alive. The transatlantic slave trade was not just an economic system. It was a calculated and sustained assault on the human spirit, justified by centuries of racist ideologies that dehumanized Africans and portrayed them as inferior. European colonizers and thinkers rationalized slavery by claiming it was civilizing for the African and necessary for the economic growth of the Western world. The Christian Church, in many instances, supported or turned a blind eye to slavery, with some arguing it was a way to convert Africans to Christianity. Over time, a complex triangle of trade emerged. Ships from Europe brought manufactured goods to Africa, exchanged them for enslaved people, transported them to the Americas, and returned with raw materials like sugar, cotton, and tobacco produced by slave labor. This cycle made immense profits for European merchants and plantation owners while devastating African societies. Entire communities were destabilized. Villages were emptied. African rulers, in many cases, became complicit in the trade, strengthening their own kingdoms through the sale of captives, but often at the cost of long-term regional instability and violence. The legacy of this trade is not limited to the past. Its impacts are still felt today. In the racial inequalities that persist across the Americas, in the generational trauma carried by descendants of enslaved people, and in the socio-economic divides shaped by centuries of exploitation. The wealth that fueled the rise of European empires was built, in large part, on the backs of enslaved Africans. Cities like London, Lisbon, Amsterdam, and Bordeaux flourished from the profits of sugar, tobacco, and slaves, while African nations were left impoverished, their human resources drained. Yet amid this cruelty, there were moments of resistance, bravery, and dignity. Enslaved Africans rebelled in many ways. Some organized uprisings, such as the Haitian Revolution, which would ultimately lead to the first free black republic in the Western Hemisphere. Others used more subtle forms of resistance, working slowly, breaking tools, or keeping cultural practices alive in secret. These acts were profound affirmations of humanity in the face of a system designed to erase it. This was not just a story of victimhood. It was also a story of survival, endurance, and the unbreakable spirit of a people who refused to be defined by the chains that bound them. Across the 17th and 18th centuries, the transatlantic slave trade entrenched itself with ever-deepening roots, weaving a profit-driven web that linked European port cities, West and Central African coastal forts, and the plantation colonies of the Americas into a single, voracious machine of human exploitation. As European powers jostled for imperial dominance, England, France, the Dutch Republic, Denmark, Norway, and eventually a rising United States joining Portugal and Spain, competition for slave labor escalated, and the sheer scale of trafficking ballooned. In African interior regions, networks of traders, mercenaries, and local rulers hunted captives with merciless efficiency, employing firearms traded by Europeans for slaves, gold, ivory, or pepper, thus feeding cycles of warfare and insecurity that destabilized entire kingdoms. Caravans of fettered prisoners, forced to march weeks or months through dense forests, arid savannas, and disease-ridden mangrove swamps, dwindled as exhaustion, dysentery, smallpox, and sheer despair exacted their toll long before the survivors glimpsed the grim stone battlements of coastal slave castles, such as Cape Coast, Bunce Island, Gorée, Ouidah, and Luanda. There, in dank dungeons reeking of waste and seawater, men, women, and children languished in darkness awaiting the next vessel. Each cannon blast announcing a slave ship's arrival struck terror into hearts already shattered by violence and separation. European merchants, armed with insurance contracts and financial instruments perfected in London, Amsterdam, or Bordeaux, calculated profits down to the last shilling, factoring average loss of human cargo just as they would for barrels of rum or sacks of sugar, demonstrating how slavery became embedded not only in plantation fields but in burgeoning capitalist markets and nascent global finance. When the tide and winds proved favorable, captives were herded onto wooden decks coated with iron manacles and misery, beginning the horrific Middle Passage once more. Ships like the Brooks, whose notorious schematic revealed row upon row of bodies packed spoon fashion, became gruesome symbols of industrialized brutality. Crew members wielding cat-o'-nine tails enforced order while surgeons logged mortality statistics, yet even the cold arithmetic could not capture the stench of vomit and excreta, the shrieks of the tortured, or the muffled hymns of resilience hummed in secret tongues. Storms frequently battered the overloaded hulls. Lightning illuminated scenes of chained families clinging to one another, and when barrels of water ran low, captains sometimes elected to jettison the least profitable human cargo, a euphemism masking mass murder at sea. Insurance courts in London later debated whether such drownings constituted legitimate losses, revealing a system that had converted black life into ledger entries. Upon disembarkation in Bridgetown, Charleston, Cartagena, or Salvador da Bahia, merchants revived captives with food, lime juice, and brutal scrubbing intended to fetch higher auction prices. In the British Caribbean, Slave codes such as Barbados's 1661 statute crystallized racial hierarchies into law by asserting that Africans were chattel for life, stripping them of legal personhood and sanctioning horrendous punishment, from iron masks and neck collars to mutilation and death, for any perceived defiance. French colonies codified similar regimes in the Code Noir of 1685, ostensibly granting token protections but in practice fortifying white supremacy. Spanish America employed the Siete Partidas and Royal Cédulas, while Portuguese Brazil blended Roman Catholic paternalism with savage enforcement. Across these jurisdictions, violence became a language of control. Overseers brandished whips, plantation bells dictated waking, working, and sleeping, and surveillance extended into every moment of enslaved existence. Yet amid oppression flourished remarkable cultural creativity and resistance. Syncretic religions such as Voodoo in Saint-Domingue, Candomblé in Bahia, and Santeria in Cuba fused West African cosmologies, Yoruba, Fon, Congo, Igbo, with Catholic saints, forging spiritual frameworks that nurtured solidarity and hope. Maroon communities, from Jamaica's cockpit country to Suriname's dense rainforests, emerged as beacons of autonomy where escaped slaves built fortified villages, cultivated hidden gardens, and conducted guerrilla warfare against colonial militias. Leaders like Queen Nanny of the Maroons and the Palmares warrior Genga Zumba embodied the tenacity of freedom dreams. Economically, slave-produced commodities fueled an insatiable European appetite. Sugar-sweetened tea in London parlours, coffee energized Parisian cafes, and cotton fed Manchester's roaring mills, knitting together an Atlantic consumer revolution whose luxuries masked the agony in every spoonful and bowl of cloth. Profits underwrote grand Georgian townhouses, financed Enlightenment academies, and even endowed universities whose halls echoed with debates about liberty while ignoring the enslaved millions enabling such discourse. Philosophers like John Locke invested in the Royal African Company. Banks such as Barclays and Baring Brothers traced early capital to slave ventures, and Lloyd's of London thrived by ensuring voyages rife with human misery. This jarring contradiction, liberty proclaimed in pamphlets yet denied in plantations, became stark during the American Revolution, when patriots invoking natural rights simultaneously preserved a slave economy across the southern colonies. African Americans, discerning hypocrisy, joined whichever side offered escape. Thousands fled behind British lines after Lord Dunmore's 1775 proclamation promising freedom to rebel slaves, while others fought for the Continental Army, hoping revolutionary rhetoric might eventually encompass them. Across the Atlantic, intellectual currents began to shift. Quaker meetings in Pennsylvania, Baptist congregations in London, and enlightened salons in Paris produced the first sustained moral critiques of slavery. Figures like Otto Bakugo-Ano, a Ghanaian abolitionist in Britain, penned searing indictments. Olata Equiano's 1789 autobiography detailed the harrowing Middle Passage and rallied public opinion, and Anthony Benezet's tracts circulated widely among religious dissenters. In France, the Société des Amis des Noirs called for gradual emancipation, though revolutionary upheaval would soon render gradual obsolete. British abolitionists formed the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade in 1787, deploying petitions, sugar boycotts, and grisly engravings of slave ships to awaken a populace accustomed to profiting from distant cruelty. William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson, and Granville Sharp lobbied Parliament relentlessly, compiling testimonies from sailors whose conscience gnawed at them and from physicians who condemned the voyage as a health catastrophe. Meanwhile, Haitian bonds of bondage snapped under the weight of extraordinary revolt. Beginning in 1791, enslaved laborers in Saint-Domingue torched plantations and waged a revolutionary war that defeated French, Spanish, and British forces alike, culminating in the 1804 Declaration of Haiti's independence, the first nation born of a successful slave uprising and a seismic blow to planter confidence throughout the hemisphere. White refugees poured into Charleston, New Orleans, and Havana, spreading tales of black vengeance that fueled draconian laws, while free black communities across the Atlantic saw in Haiti a beacon heralding the possibility of emancipation. Within Africa itself, the trade's corrosive impact deepened. The rise of militarized states such as Dahomey and the Asante Empire, whose economies increasingly pivoted on slave shipment revenues, provoked endless conflicts and raids that hollowed out demographic potential. Inland craft traditions faltered as artisans were kidnapped or fled. Gender imbalances skewed communities, and agricultural productivity declined where farmers were seized en masse. Yet African agency, often overlooked, proved complex. Some rulers negotiated treaties limiting slave exports. Abolitionist missionaries collaborated with coastal elites to found colonies for recaptured slaves, like Sierra Leone's Freetown in 1787. And scholars such as Usman Dan Fodio in West Africa condemned certain aspects of the trade in their Islamic reform movements. Still, the overarching dynamic was one of depopulation and socio-political trauma whose reverberations lingered across generations. Back in Europe, the ethos of the Enlightenment collided with economic self-interest. Pamphleteers brandished the language of universal rights. Artists like J.M.W. Turner painted haunting visions of drowning slaves, and mass rallies petitioned governments to outlaw human cargo. Parliamentary hearings heard survivors describe fetid holds and flogged bodies, their words echoing beneath vaulted ceilings lined with merchants who quietly tallied the cost of reform. In 1807, after decades of activism, Britain passed the Slave Trade Act, prohibiting the transatlantic trafficking of Africans for British subjects, and the United States followed in 1808 with a similar ban. Yet slavery itself persisted, finding new veins of expansion in Cuba's sugar boom, Brazil's coffee frontier, and the American Deep South's explosive cotton kingdom driven by the cotton gin's invention. Thus, as the legal slave trade faced mounting opposition, illicit smuggling intensified, and internal markets such as the brutal overland coffles from Virginia to Mississippi replaced Atlantic arrivals, prolonging agony within continental borders. Throughout these transitions, enslaved people continued crafting cultures of resilience. Work songs synchronized movements in cane rows, ring shouts fused West African rhythms with Christian hymns, and folk tales of trickster heroes like Anansi the spider imparted lessons of cunning survival. Herbal knowledge preserved by midwives offered remedies against tropical diseases that decimated plantation populations. In the cores of cabins lit by pine knot torches, elders whispered ancestral memories that defied the erasure of name and nation. Acts of defiance, arson, poisoning, conspiracies like Gabriel's Rebellion in 1800 Virginia, kept owners fearful and chipped at the edifice of domination. Even the simple act of literacy, taught clandestinely, posed a radical threat to a system predicated on ignorance. Enslaved preachers such as Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner drew upon biblical narratives of Exodus to mobilize visions of deliverance, proving that hope, though persecuted, could neither be legislated nor whipped out of existence. Thus, by the dawn of the 19th century, the transatlantic slave trade stood at a perilous crossroads, morally assailed by growing abolitionist fervor yet still pumping lifeblood into Atlantic economies. Politically contested in parliaments but defended by planters and merchants whose fortunes depended on bondage. Socially entrenched in colonies where racial caste dictated every aspect of life yet constantly undermined by the very people it sought to break. The stage was set for a new century of struggle in which abolitionists would wrestle with entrenched interests.
Formerly enslaved voices would rise to global prominence, and the question of whether a modern world predicated on liberty could coexist with human enslavement would demand a decisive answer.
As the 19th century advanced, global attitudes toward slavery and the transatlantic slave trade began to shift, although progress remains slow and uneven. The emergence of abolitionist movements in Britain, the United States, France, and elsewhere reflected a growing moral, religious, and humanitarian awareness that challenged the centuries-old normalization of human bondage. The voices of formerly enslaved individuals became powerful instruments of change. People like Frederick Douglass in America, Olaudah Equiano in Britain, and Mary Prince from the Caribbean used their personal testimonies to expose the horrors of enslavement. Their stories were widely read and shared, sparking outrage, empathy, and demands for justice. Churches, particularly Quaker congregations and evangelical movements, also played a significant role in shaping public opinion. Christian moral reformers began to question how a religion based on love and compassion could continue to support a system that thrived on violence, cruelty, and exploitation. Sermons were preached, pamphlets were distributed, and abolitionist societies multiplied, slowly building the political momentum that would eventually lead to legislative reform. In Britain, public pressure led to the passage of the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act in 1807, which made it illegal to engage in the slave trade throughout the British Empire. But enforcement was a challenge. British naval ships were tasked with patrolling the Atlantic Ocean to intercept illegal slave ships, and courts were established in places like Sierra Leone to try slavers. However, slave traders became more cunning and secretive. They operated under foreign flags, used smaller and faster ships, and hid their human cargo in false compartments. Smuggling routes expanded into Cuba, Brazil, and the southern United States, where the demand for enslaved labor remained strong. The Portuguese and Spanish empires, in particular, continued to traffic Africans into Brazil and the Caribbean despite growing international pressure. By the mid-1800s, Brazil had become the largest importer of African slaves in the world. Millions were transported to work in sugar, coffee, and rubber plantations, especially in regions like Bahia and São Paulo. Even as international consensus began to form against the slave trade, its economic foundation proved difficult to dismantle. In the United States, the end of the transatlantic trade in 1808 did not end slavery itself. Instead, a domestic slave trade emerged with horrifying intensity. Enslaved people were forcibly relocated from older tobacco-growing regions in the Upper South, like Virginia and Maryland, to the rapidly expanding cotton plantations of the Deep South in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. This internal forced migration, known as the Second Middle Passage, saw over 1 million people uprooted from their homes and marched in chains across states, families torn apart yet again. Auction blocks, slave pens, and brothels lined the roadsides of burgeoning southern cities. Cotton had become king, and enslaved labor was its backbone. As American agriculture industrialized, so too did the brutality of its systems of forced labor. In response, the voices of resistance grew stronger. Black Americans, enslaved and free, organized, preached, rebelled, and escaped whenever possible. Harriet Tubman, a former slave herself, became a legendary conductor on the Underground Railroad, guiding dozens of enslaved people to freedom through secret routes and safe houses. Nat Turner led a violent revolt in Virginia in 1831 that terrified white slaveholders and resulted in even harsher laws, but it also reignited abolitionist fervor. Meanwhile, in Europe, the abolitionist cause reached new heights. Following decades of campaigning and petitioning, Britain finally passed the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833, legally ending slavery across most of the British Empire. Thousands of enslaved individuals in the Caribbean, South Africa, and parts of Canada were declared free, though many were forced into so-called apprenticeship schemes that continued their exploitation in new forms. France abolished slavery in its colonies in 1848, under pressure from revolutionaries and humanitarian voices. Denmark, the Netherlands, and other nations followed suit. Yet full liberation remained elusive for millions. In the Americas, resistance to abolition was fierce. Plantation owners, merchants, and political elites resisted reforms with all their power, arguing that their economic survival depended on slave labor. In Cuba, sugar barons clung to slavery until 1886. In Brazil, the last country in the Western world to abolish slavery, it wasn't until 1888, after years of struggle, protest, and international embarrassment, that the institution was finally ended by law. The long road to abolition was not just political or legal, it was deeply spiritual and human. Enslaved Africans and their descendants carried a burning sense of dignity and hope that no chain could break. They built vibrant communities, developed spiritual systems, and forged identities in the face of unimaginable hardship. Music, religion, oral traditions, and art became tools of both survival and resistance. Work songs, gospel hymns, and spirituals communicated pain, memory, and dreams of deliverance. African traditions merged with European influences to create unique and resilient cultures in the Americas. Creolized languages, religious syncretism, cuisine, fashion, and dance forms that endure to this day. Cultural resistance often went hand in hand with open rebellion. Slave uprisings occurred across the Caribbean and Latin America. In Jamaica, the Baptist War of 1831, led by Samuel Sharp, involved tens of thousands of enslaved people and accelerated the abolition movement in Britain. In Puerto Rico and Cuba, plots and revolts were met with bloody repression. In Haiti, the legacy of the revolution continued to inspire other movements across the hemisphere, though the young nation was isolated and punished by Western powers, especially France and the United States, for daring to rise up and declare black freedom. Even as slavery was gradually dismantled, the trauma it inflicted remained deeply embedded. Generations of families had been destroyed. Whole communities and civilizations in Africa had been fractured and depopulated. The psychological scars, the systemic inequalities, and the global legacy of white supremacy, built in part on the normalization of African dehumanization, persisted long after the last chains were officially broken. Formerly enslaved people faced tremendous challenges in post-emancipation societies. In the American South, black codes and Jim Crow laws enforced segregation and second-class citizenship. In Brazil and the Caribbean, freed people were denied land, education, or political participation, often forced into sharecropping or low-wage labor on the very plantations where they had once been enslaved. Racist ideologies, justified for centuries by pseudo-scientific theories, continued to shape institutions, economies, and social hierarchies worldwide. This wasn't just a history of slavery, it was the root of ongoing racial injustice. The transatlantic slave trade had not only displaced millions, it reshaped the world. African populations suffered catastrophic loss. The American continent was built, quite literally, on the bones and labor of the enslaved. The wealth of Europe, its cities, banks, universities, ports, and industries, was fueled by profits made from sugar, cotton, tobacco, and coffee grown by African hands. African identities were transformed, diaspora communities scattered across the globe, and a global black consciousness began to emerge. Over time, descendants of enslaved people began to reclaim their histories, assert their rights, and demand recognition, not only of their suffering but of their contributions to global civilization. Figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, Sojourner Truth, and Booker T. Washington continued the struggle for justice and identity in the modern world. The Harlem Renaissance, Pan-African Congresses, independence movements in Africa and the Caribbean, and the Civil Rights Movement all drew strength from the collective memory of the transatlantic trauma. The centuries of the slave trade were marked by cruelty, but they were also marked by resilience. Against every lash, there was a prayer. Against every chain, a dream. Against every sail, a bond that refused to break in the heart. The story of the transatlantic slave trade is not just a story of what was done to Africans. It is a story of how they endured, resisted, and ultimately reshaped the very world that tried to erase them. Their strength, creativity, and determination laid the foundation for modern societies. Their spirit lives on in languages, religions, music, literature, and philosophy. As we explore this dark history, we are also called to reflect on its continued impact today, on race relations, justice, inequality, and the global fight for human dignity. As the 19th century drew to a close and the transatlantic slave trade was officially outlawed in most parts of the world, the echoes of its horrors continued to shape societies on both sides of the Atlantic. While the physical chains were broken, the psychological and structural chains of slavery remained deeply embedded. Abolition did not automatically bring freedom in its fullest sense. Formerly enslaved people, whether in the Americas, the Caribbean, or Brazil, were often left without resources, property, or protection. They faced a new form of enslavement through systemic racism, economic deprivation, and social exclusion. The institutions of slavery had been replaced with laws, policies, and ideologies that perpetuated inequality under a different name. Even as the slave ships stopped sailing, the legacy of the trade cast a long and heavy shadow. Many former slave owners received compensation for their loss of property, while the enslaved received nothing. In countries like the United States, newly freed black citizens were subjected to black codes and vagrancy laws that criminalized their very existence. Across Latin America and the Caribbean, racial hierarchies continued to dictate social status, and African descendants were pushed to the margins of political and economic life. Yet, amid these continued struggles, black communities began to organize, mobilize, and resist in new ways. Cultural resilience played a central role in their survival. The music, languages, religions, and artistic traditions that were born in the crucible of slavery became powerful tools of identity and resistance. From the drumbeats of West Africa that survived in samba, reggae, and blues, to the spiritual resilience passed down in gospel music and church traditions, a deep cultural legacy was preserved and expanded. Education became a revolutionary act. Newly freed people established schools, churches, and civic institutions. Black writers, preachers, teachers, and activists began to challenge the narratives that had long dehumanized them. The press, literature, and early scholarship provided platforms for self-expression and redefinition. Movements like the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s would later emerge from these roots, giving rise to a global black consciousness that demanded recognition, dignity, and justice. In the early 20th century, the legacy of the slave trade began to take on global political dimensions. The Pan-African movement, led by figures like W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, sought to unite people of African descent around the world in a shared struggle against colonialism, racism, and economic exploitation. This movement directly connected the history of slavery to contemporary issues of imperialism and segregation. In Africa, where the loss of millions to slavery had left deep scars, European colonialism continued the plunder and oppression through new forms of domination. The psychological wounds inflicted by centuries of viewing Africans as inferior, as commodities, and as voiceless persisted not only in the institutions of former colonial powers but also in global attitudes toward the African continent and its people. Education systems, textbooks, public monuments, and national histories often ignored or distorted the reality of slavery, erasing the agency, suffering, and contributions of African peoples. This erasure became part of the continued violence of the transatlantic slave trade's legacy. Despite this, descendants of the enslaved continued to reclaim their narratives. Across the African diaspora, scholars, artists, and activists worked to uncover hidden histories and honor ancestral struggles. Museums, memorials, and academic programs were created to preserve the memory of those lost and to teach future generations about the true scope and impact of the trade. In Senegal, the House of Slaves on Gorée Island became a symbol of remembrance. In the Americas, historical sites such as plantations, slave auction blocks, and burial grounds were preserved as spaces of education and mourning. Literature and film began to challenge silence and misrepresentation, giving voice to the experiences of the enslaved and their descendants. Novels like Toni Morrison's Beloved and historical works like Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery redefined the intellectual landscape and made it impossible to ignore the central role slavery played in shaping the modern world. Internationally, the 20th and 21st centuries saw increased calls for reparations and justice. Advocates argued that the centuries-long exploitation and brutalization of African people warranted not only acknowledgement but tangible restitution. Caribbean nations formed the CARICOM Reparations Commission, demanding accountability from former European colonial powers. In the United States, ongoing debates about reparations gained prominence in political and social discourse. Some institutions began to take steps toward reconciliation. Universities acknowledged their historical ties to slavery. Churches issued formal apologies, and some governments offered public recognition of the trade's atrocities. Yet the path to meaningful repair remained fraught with controversy and resistance. Critics argued against monetary compensation, while advocates emphasized that reparations were not only about finances but also about historical truth, healing, and systemic transformation. What cannot be denied is that the transatlantic slave trade was a foundational force in shaping the modern world. It powered the growth of capitalism, fueled the expansion of empires, and transformed the demographic, cultural, and political makeup of entire continents. It established racial ideologies that would later justify apartheid, segregation, and countless forms of discrimination. It disrupted civilizations in Africa, stripped millions of their freedom, and forced them into labor that enriched others while impoverishing them. But the story does not end with victimhood. The story is also one of survival, strength, and an unbreakable will. The descendants of the enslaved built communities, cultures, and movements that have enriched humanity. They have contributed to every field of human endeavor, from politics and philosophy to music, science, and the arts. Their struggle for liberation became a catalyst for other human rights movements around the globe. Their continued resistance and resilience serve as a testament to the power of the human spirit. Today, remembering the transatlantic slave trade is not merely an act of historical curiosity, it is a moral imperative. It forces us to confront the systems of exploitation, racism, and inequality that persist in modern times. It challenges us to reckon with how wealth, power, and privilege were built and to consider what justice and repair look like in the present. It compels educators to teach truthfully, governments to act responsibly, and individuals to reflect deeply. Monuments must rise not only to kings and generals but also to the millions who endured captivity and built nations with their blood and sweat. Statues must not only honor conquest but also resistance. And history must not only record the deeds of empires but also the voices of the oppressed. To understand slavery is to understand the foundations of our modern societies. To acknowledge it is to take the first step toward healing. To remember it is to ensure that such cruelty is never repeated. In the end, the transatlantic slave trade is not only a history of what was done to people, it is a history of
how people survived what was done to them. It is the story of millions who, though bound in chains, kept their cultures, faith, and humanity alive. It is the story of how the worst of human behavior was met with the best of human courage. It is a warning and a witness. And as long as injustice exists, their story must continue to be told, not as a footnote, but as a central chapter in the story of our shared human journey.
You've just witnessed one of the darkest punishments in history. But many more still lurk in the shadows. So if you dare, subscribe to Torture Vault, where every scream from the past still echoes.